Hello and welcome to Why It's Bad, a series where we look at the bad qualities of good games. Today we are going to take a look at the recently released Thymesia, described as a grueling action RPG with fast-paced combat and an intricate plague weapon system. To address the elephant in the room, this game is also pinned as a Souls-like, but to be fair, it mostly resembles Sekiro out of the bunch. Not to sound derivative, but the combat system is very close in concept to how Sekiro's functions for better or worse. Comparisons can be made through the game's level up system, where you have attributes that minimally increase your power over time, and an experience system that is lost upon death. Before we get into the bad aspects of the game, I want to make it clear that I understand a small development team created Thymesia, however, I can only critique how well the game was delivered to me. There's only so much leeway I can give when other independent and small studios have had monumental impacts across the board. However, I do think this game has its merits and is definitely fun and potentially worth your time and money. My biggest problem with Thymesia is a combination of two things: the asking price and the length of the game. Thymesia is currently for sale on Steam for $25. I beat the game in about 6 hours. I got all the achievements in about 11. There's an achievement that requires you to break 1,000 barrels. Completing this took longer than any other section of the game did. Certain games can get away with being a short experience because the experience itself is great. The Castlevania games are a perfect example of this. Thymesia is a good game, but it isn't a great one, and I have to imagine that more areas to explore, more bosses to fight would make me enjoy the game more. Less is not more in this case, and I hope the developers add free content updates with new areas to the game instead of paid DLC because the game is already overpriced as is. Hollow Knight costs $15 on Steam with an average playtime of 25 hours for the main story. Even games like Remnant have longer playtimes than Thymesia. Both the level and world design of each major area did not knock my socks off at any point in the game. The Sea of Trees, Royal Garden, and Hermes Fortress all function identically. Each area is split into a couple major missions with sub-missions in between them, which in theory is a cool idea akin to Nioh's mission system. However, Thymesia's submissions are mostly skippable and unimpactful. The submissions are just the main mission areas rearranged. You might go through an area you've completed before but backwards, or through a separate path, but they all lead to the same spot. When going through the missions the first time, I always felt like I had been through the same area over and over, but couldn't remember if I went through the area on this mission or the one before. I was confused because the missions meld together, not because the level design had me lost. Each level and mission is also very linear. You follow one path and it might split off for a couple steps before leading to a dead end. There really isn't any variation to this formula, and the game doesn't give you any reason to explore off the main path anyway. 3 major regions feel very similar, just with a different coat of paint slapped on. Yellow for the Sea of Trees, red for the Royal Garden, and green for Hermes' Fortress. Thymesia really suffers from an all-around lack of loot in every facet of the game. The only items you'll pick up in your travels are consumables that give you points to level up, and lore tidbits that 90% of the players probably won't care about. I read each one in the first area, but got bored of reading every time I picked one up. This also means there is no armor to find to change the character to a way you want them to look, and no weapons, so you're stuck with the same attack pattern the whole game, which we'll get into later. Having at least one unique armor set from each area would be really cool. It could have resembled the aesthetic of the area and been completely cosmetic, so no gameplay balancing would be needed. The consumable items you acquire all give the same amount of runes, memory shards as well. The game should progress with the player, and we should be rewarded in kind for traversing through a more difficult area. There really is no point in looting the area because the levels feel so minimal anyway, and there aren't stat requirements for certain builds, so we never have to be a certain level. And the lore definitely won't appeal to everyone, so a lot of it feels skippable. The main draw of the game is the atmosphere and the combat. Both are pretty good but can definitely be improved upon. If you've played Sekiro, the combat system is very similar. You whittle the opponent's health down through fast attacks, parrying their attacks, and instead of shinobi tools in Sekiro, Thymesia uses what's called plague weapons, which you can acquire by killing certain enemies. The plague weapons each have a unique attack or give the player some form of buff or healing that uses a limited resource called plague energy. For the most part, the combat is the best part of the game. It is very fluid and rewarding when you learn what your opponent is going to do and how to correctly punish their attacks. Fundamentally, the combat is great, but a few outside elements affect the fun factor of the fighting. Now, none of these factors ruin the experience on their own, but all combined together affects my enjoyment of the game. First and foremost, only having one weapon sucks. I felt this way in Sekiro, but Sekiro's combat and interactions feel much more fleshed out. Adding more weapons with different movesets gives players more ways to customize their experience and circumvent and overcome the dangers the world throws at them, instead of being forced into one playstyle. Even adding one or two unique weapons would greatly increase my enjoyment of the game. A main draw for the Dark Souls games for me is learning and overcoming challenges. Learning the moveset of an enemy and then growing to know how to easily dispose of both enemies and bosses feels great. Thymesia has no unique enemies amongst the areas. Each enemy you see in the first area will be present in every other level. Each mission mainly consists of night-type enemies and peasants, with the occasional special enemy that's really only present in the Sea of Thieves. Across each major area, I knew what to expect and never had to change my playstyle to beat a certain enemy, which completely removes the learning curve. I never felt threatened traversing the missions. I never had to think about what I was doing to complete the levels. Now, the combat should be fully explored and at its peak during the boss fights, and Thymesia's boss fights are unfortunately hit or miss. Thymesia has 8 boss fights. 4 of them I really liked and showcased how fun the combat can be. The other 4 are wastes of space. Both Ordur fights, Varg, and Erd are really fun close quarter fights that leave you on edge the whole time. I wish all of the boss fights were like this. The Fool's God is very reminiscent of the Dragon God from Demon Souls, but more closely resembles the Ancient Wyvern from Dark Souls 3 on a mechanical level. You don't actually fight the boss, you just run through the level killing ads where you have to, then one-shotting the boss at the end, which is a huge bummer because the God of Fools looks really cool and would have been cool to actually defeat with my skill, not by pressing one button. The Hanged Queen suffers from Big Beast Enemy Syndrome, which all Souls-like games also suffer from. Since the enemy is so big and we fight so closely, it's sometimes hard to see what move it's preparing for and the camera can sometimes work against you. But aside from that, the boss is incredibly easy and probably won't kill many people. The Sound of the Abyss is by far the least enjoyable encounter. It isn't hard or visually appealing like the Fool's God is. There is a lot of downtime which boss fights shouldn't have. I shouldn't be able to just stand there and not be punished for my lack of paying attention. The boss fight also ends up just being a one-button press kill fight. While the Sound of the Abyss is the least enjoyable, the last boss is the most disappointing. You fight yourself, which is super lame. The boss uses your own moveset and various plague weapons, but they all function identically to yours, so all the timings and counterplays should be known to you. This fight has no learning curve, and it's a tired and old trope to begin with. Dark Souls 3 ends with the Soul of Cinder, but that fight rules. This one's a cheap attempt at recreating your greatest enemy will always be yourself. Now, it's one thing to sit here and criticize the game for what it is, but I want to articulate how I would approach making changes. I would remove the mission system and just make each area one big level, so we don't traverse through recycled content. Adding additional weapons and armor would add some longevity to the game as well, and maybe more enemy types sprinkled in too. Leveling up is also really expensive, and enemies, as well as bosses, don't give a lot of memory points either, so lowering the cost while increasing the streams of revenue would be nice. I would also increase the aggro range and distance for enemies. It's so easy to just run through each level with no consequence because you aren't missing any valuable loot or cool areas since the game is so linear already. Enemies also have a weird property where if they leave their designated area, they lose aggro of you and regen their health. Just think it's a little weird. Also, I can't reiterate this enough, paid DLC is a big no. This game doesn't have enough content to justify the price or enough replayability either. Free title updates to make the game better and healthier have to be the way. I'm afraid it won't last much longer. Thymesia also has little to no replayability outside of farming for achievements. With the lack of difficulty settings to make the game harder, or a traditional New Game Plus feature, you're stuck to one playthrough. I wanted to play through the game again with all the plague weapons I had obtained, but I wasn't able to. I want to be more challenged by this game. I do want to make sure that we're all on the same page. This game isn't bad at all, it just isn't that great. With some helpful changes and love from the dev team, I'm sure this can turn into something really cool. The foundation has already been created for it. I'm looking forward to news from the developers, but I'm not holding my breath in anticipation.